I don't remember the exact words that he used, but something I learned from my father was the link between history and current events. If you want to understand the world, to be able to read current events with any kind of insight, take the time to understand the past. It sounds so obvious, but it's a necessary reminder in a society that has struggled to learn how to remember and tell its history in a meaningful, truthful, and transformative way. Nowhere is that more obvious in the U.S. experience, I think, than in the observance of Black History Month. Boston University welcomes students visiting their website who are interested in history with a page dispelling the myths about studying history. And the first myth, and probably one I encounter most in conversations, is history is boring. They wrote, maybe you had awkward experiences in high school. You assume history is going to be all names and dates and one damn thing after another, as the saying goes. Maybe like Virginia Woolf, you've concluded that history is too much about old men and their wars, or that it is more or less bunk, as Henry Ford proclaimed. Then again, Ford also called physical exercise bunk, so he might not be the best authority. I can certainly understand that aversion. My experience of history in public schools was also largely negative, with a few bright points that had more to do with the idiosyncrasies of my teachers than any fascination with the content itself. And the content was often presented in a way that made it difficult to be interested, with that focus more on memorizing dates than on understanding how the story of humanity had unfolded. Too often, the books we used were incomplete. They were missing key voices and perspectives, and sometimes they even justified or promoted injustice, violence, and oppression. Usually, there wasn't anyone in those stories that I could recognize, except for the people at the bottom who existed mainly to get crushed. When it came to white supremacy, the content was basically non-existent. And probably the only thing more invisible than the existence and cruelty of white supremacy was the existence of people who were not white and their contributions to history and society. This trend is well documented in books like James Loewen's Lies My Teacher Told Me, and in teaching resources like the Zen Education Project. But we are continuing to get a fuller picture of just how wrong our history textbooks have been. Donald Yacovone is a historian who you might remember co-authored The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross with Henry Louis Gates Jr. back in 2013. A few years ago, he was researching another project when he came across a collection of about 3,000 U.S. history textbooks. Encountering those books led him to a different project that became a book scheduled for publication in September 2022 titled Teaching White Supremacy: The Textbook Battle Over Race in American History. In an interview with the Harvard Gazette, Yacovone noted the trends in how these textbooks talked about white supremacy, slavery, racism, civil rights. To begin, early texts barely dealt with the institution of slavery at all, did not typically mention African Americans, and spoke about Black people in extremely derogatory ways, which is somewhat shocking considering it's a textbook. This trend showed that the writers of these books defined American, in Yacovone's words, as white and only white. Anything that was less than Anglo-Saxon was not a true American. Before the Civil War, textbooks followed a strict format, but a format that you might even recognize from your own education. It supported a political and Eurocentric narrative, beginning with exploration, colonization, revolution, creation of the Republic, and then every presidential administration in course. The Reconstruction period of our history saw some divergence from that strict format as it began including more non-white people in the telling of our history. But that dramatic change was short-lived. As Yacovone put it, the lost cause mythology takes over academia, and white supremacy reappears with full force. By this, he means that from the 1920s through the 1940s, textbooks were overwhelmingly characterized by positive assessments of slavery that taught that the African American's natural environment, in Yacovone's words, was the institution of slavery, where they were cared for from cradle to grave. The legacy of African American writing about freedom was not even recognized as existing by the white power structure. Instead, slave narratives were deemed as propaganda and excluded. African history before slavery was erased, and the work of black scholars such as W.E.B. Du Bois was ignored. This remained common until at least the mid-1960s, when the civil rights movement forced a gradual reintroduction of the African American element into history textbooks. But if you consider how long that was the normal thing and how many people have been raised learning from those kinds of textbooks, I think it goes a long way to explaining some of the dynamics that are happening even today. Jacob Owen used a powerful analogy to talk about that impact. He said, white supremacy is a toxin. The older history textbooks were like syringes that injected the toxin of white supremacy into the mind of generations of Americans. And while there has been improvement, it's also obvious that these issues remain unresolved and contentious today. Just this week, we saw the Florida Congress pass the Stop the Woke Act, banning the teaching of critical race theory. In 2020, the New York Times ran an article comparing social studies textbooks published in or after 2016. So these are current textbooks. Each textbook had a special edition prepared for California and an edition prepared for Texas, the two states with the greatest influences on textbook content here in the U.S. This meant that the chosen texts were from the same publishers, they had the same credited authors, but they existed in two different versions that were customized to satisfy policymakers who had different priorities. There were hundreds of differences that were documented, from subtle to obvious, and as you might expect, several of those differences were related to race, racism, and racial justice. For example, in California, the sections describing resistance to Reconstruction after the Civil War focused on racism of people who didn't want African Americans to have more rights, and they backed up that with primary resources. In Texas, that racist motivation is acknowledged in the text, but it's smoothed over with additional justifications that the reforms would have been expensive and they would have had to raise taxes. And while both states had content about the Harlem Renaissance and its importance, Texas students were also taught that critics dismissed the quality of the literature produced. In California, discussion of the largely white flight to suburbia acknowledged a desire to get away from more culturally diverse neighborhoods. In Texas, students learned that, quote, some people wish to escape the crime and congestion of the city. And in a discussion on immigration, California students read an excerpt from a novel about a Dominican American family, while Texas texts replaced that passage with the voice of a Border Patrol agent. The latter included a stern and, if I may say so, racist warning. If you open the border wide up, you're going to invite political and social upheaval. Other marginalized communities are treated in similar ways, including issues related to indigenous rights, immigration, gender and sexuality, and class and wealth inequality. Importantly, even the Texas editions are improvements over past textbooks. And it may be hard to believe that, but that's what happens when textbooks, even in the recent past, include such popular myths as some slave owners treated enslaved people kindly, and that African Americans were better off enslaved than free. So let's be clear. Just because we have taken some steps in the right direction, that does not mean the journey is complete. We have a lot of work to do. Returning to Boston University's invitation to study history, their webpage points out that, quote, the heart of historical study is a richly vicarious experience, teaching you to move beyond yourself and envision other worlds, to explore the interplay between material circumstances and human character. History is both a science and an art, combining the careful analysis of evidence with compelling storytelling. They go on to point out that historical knowledge is a powerful currency in the world we live in, especially the 21st century, that it makes you more culturally literate, more sensitive to understanding the world, that it helps you understand multiple viewpoints and how the world is changing in real time. They also remind us that if you study history, you will get more jokes. It also offers, in their words, a unique education in the curation of content, teaching you how to collect, evaluate, and arrange a variety of sources into persuasive arguments and narratives. By interpreting the past, you will better understand yourself, and those who know their history help to shape how people see themselves in the present and what they hope for the future. That is the invitation to studying history, especially history at the margins. The curation of content is an opportunity to center voices and points of view that are often excluded from privileged perspectives. If we're not listening at the margins, we are ignorant at the very least. Our understanding will be incomplete, and our vision of the future and who is included in that future will also be incomplete. But it's also very likely that our understanding will also be wrong without including these perspectives. In this instance, Black History Month continues to be necessary both because Black history has been excluded from our social awareness, that is, our understanding has been incomplete, and because the history we have been taught is inaccurate, our understanding is wrong. In preparing for these reflections, I came across an article by the novelist Yaa Gyasi, who wrote, the article was titled, "White People, Black Authors Are Not Your Medicine," from March of 2021. And she put into words this wondrous capacity for reading to challenge, deepen, and change us, which I experience in both literature and history. She shared, "I read Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye for the first time when I was a teenager, and it was so crystalline, so beautifully and perfectly formed that it filled me with something close to terror. I couldn't fathom it. I couldn't fathom how a novel could pierce right through the heart of me and find the inarticulable wound. I learned absolutely nothing, but some minor adjustment was made within me, some imperceptible shift that occurs only when I encounter wonder and awe, the best art." That is the power of words to shape and change us, the power of a story to shape and change us. But it's in stark contrast to what often happens. Reflecting on her experience of being a best-selling novelist, she wrote about the contrast between how white male authors have been treated compared to how she and her colleagues' experiences and how they've been treated as neither white nor male. Amid this discussion, she points out the failure of readers to allow text to challenge, deepen, and change us. She said, "When an interviewer asks me what it's like to see Homegoing on the bestseller list again, I say something short and vacuous like it's bittersweet. Because the idea of elaborating exhausts and offends me. What I should say is, why are we back here? Why am I being asked questions that James Baldwin answered in the 1960s, that Toni Morrison answered in the 1980s? She answers that, at least in part, it's because those who need to do the work of being challenged and changed are not doing that work. This is the well-ingrained habit of us well-intentioned white folks who reduce buying books by Black authors to, in her words, a theoretical, grievously belated, and utterly impoverished response to centuries of physical and emotional harm. If we treat history and literature written by writers of color as a kind of medicine, as Gyasi points out, that we have to swallow in order to improve our condition, we do so in a way that communicates, in her words, they don't really want it. They don't really enjoy it. And if they're being totally honest, they don't actually even take the medicine half the time. They just buy it and leave it on the shelf. What pleasure, what deepening could there be in reading like that? Now, I'm not trying to discourage anyone from the joy of buying books that you currently don't have time to read. I think that is a wonderful hobby and a great one. There's a lot of satisfaction in it. But some honesty is also important on this point. It's no substitute for doing the work. And there are way more effective ways of paying reparations than buying books. LaGarrett J. King helpfully describes that gap between the intentions and the impact of studying Black history, especially for us white folks. we are learning about Black history instead of through Black history. Teaching about Black history can be done without disrupting the current order of things, a perspective King calls how white people imagine Black histories. Teaching through Black history is a radical shift in power and perspective, adopting what King calls a Black historical consciousness that requires listening, writing, and teaching narratives from the actual historical experiences and voices of Black people. This fundamental shift in how we read and listen is essential. It's a continuous practice that undermines the conditioning we've received that automatically elevates white voices, actions, perspectives, and judgments over all others. Similarly, and as King notes, it invites us to recognize Black people's full humanity and emphasize pedagogical practices that reimagine the legitimacy, selection, and interpretation of historical sources. Finally, please note that the failure that I'm addressing here is not with Black historians or Black writers or Black educators who have been doing this work for generations. The neglect is not with them. This failure rests within our broader culture and within ourselves. This culture that we've inherited and promoted that values the centering of whiteness in social studies that's often so blatant that we cannot accurately call it anything but white supremacy. As part of undermining and transforming that cruel tradition, King recommends 6 principles for studying Black history, and I highly recommend reading his article and exploring those important ideas and commitments. And some of the principles have become, gladly, increasingly familiar, such as bringing attention to the systemic aspects of power, oppression, and racism, and the importance of how multiple intersecting identities shape the lived experience of Black people. Others have often received less attention, such as the importance of comparative studies of Black histories across Africa and the African diaspora worldwide. But one of these principles seems especially important to bear in mind in how we encounter, study, and are transformed by Black history. He wrote, "Focus on Black joy through liberation and radical projects that defied oppressive structures throughout history." As we explored several weeks ago, we are more than our trauma, and Black people are more than their experience of racism. An approach that too narrowly focuses on oppression and trauma dehumanizes marginalized communities. So let's remember, Black joy is also Black history. Black art and culture are part of resistance and liberation. So study Black history that includes the whole lives of Black people, families, communities, and movements. Read Black literature that opens up different worlds of perspectives for you. We need to be challenged and transformed by the answers James Baldwin gave in the 60s and Toni Morrison gave in the 80s, so that we'll also be better able to hear the voices of people speaking today. The people in control of textbooks may have made history boring, but they knew that controlling the story was connected with controlling the people. So remember, studying history and literature can also be a form of resistance if we do so in a way that challenges and changes us. And there's nothing boring about working together to create communities where justice and love can flourish in the hearts and lives of every human being. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.